I have to tell you, I was just in Canada with some colleagues, and we're creating like a summit, and we, it was three women, and I had really just met them, even though I'd spoken to them on the phone several times or through Zoom. And one night we were just kind of hanging out, and I said, "Wow, I just I need a massage." And then one of them came up and started to massage my neck, and then I was massaging her feet, and it wasn't sexual. It was actually just being a kindred spirit, and it didn't mean anything except maybe it was a development of some trust that was completely nonverbal.
I love the word that you use, the trust, because it is, right? And I know sometimes people think that when people get together and they're interacting in that way, they may think that, okay, it's a sexual thing or it can mean something else, but sometimes it's just relaxation. It's just
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. And we have many different places within our bodies, and it's going to be different for everyone depending on if the body holds memories, and all of our bodies hold memories, where those memories are held. And maybe there are areas where that's taboo, and maybe there are areas where it's okay. And you can be in discovery with a partner if you have one, but also, sometimes with friends. And it's okay. It doesn't mean, oh, we're in a relationship. Maybe it's just that you're friends and you're being kind to one another.
Yeah, yeah. Like I look back on the people I've been in relationships with, and that was something that I wish happened more of. The
Mm.
sensuality, right? Without it leading necessarily to the intercourse, it could just be okay, we're just soothing each other in this way, relaxing each other that way. Sometimes it may, but sometimes it doesn't, right?
That's right. Totally, totally. It's interesting that you bring that up because we somehow think that trust should just be, right? And in the world that I work in, where there's grief and there's the traumatic imprint and there's sex, obviously, and one's developing sexual sense of self. And I'm not talking about sensual. Trust is very tricky, and it's not automatic. There's not a trust button that we push. There's something within our bodies, within our guts, within our nervous systems that says, okay, this feels safe enough. And that safe enough is going to be different with whomever you interact with. It's not going to be the same with you as it's going to be with someone maybe I've known for years, and they've held me as I've cried and laughed. So it's trust is a very it's not an auto, it's not on autopilot.
How do
And
you think, what are some of the ways then we can get to a point where we have that level of trust in our relationships, but I guess more importantly within ourselves to allow someone to soothe us that way?
mhm. It's it's a philosophical question, right? Because can someone soothe us? That's the first question. Or do we first, the first line of attention needs to be, how do we soothe ourselves? And how do we have the conversation with ourselves first? Because if we can have that conversation with ourselves, I don't care if you're, where you are, in your makeup, or who you are, whoever is listening today, it's how do you soothe yourself? And if you're soothing yourself through mm, perhaps more unhealthy choices, then those unhealthy choices, and I don't have to label them. You all know what they are, right? Um, and they're going to be different again for everyone. Then you're not really being present with the self. You're just creating an immunity to yourself. So, how do you stay awake and self soothe? And I talk about breath, I talk about exercise, I talk about eating well, I talk about having friends and having community and being very aware that if those friends don't feel like friends, sometimes you got to let them go so that you can go on your next adventure, because we are always changing and evolving, and those friendships are always changing and evolving. I've got friends that I've had since junior high, and I mean, oh my God, they're amazing and they know me really, really well. And there have been moments in our lives where there's needed to be a hiatus, and then we come back together again and we do a dance. So, but do I trust that person? Yeah, with my life, and sometimes I think it sounds kind of crazy, but sometimes, and I wonder if you ever think this, if I were dying, who would I want to be by my side?
Beautiful question. I know exactly who I would want there. It's interesting you say that. I know who I would want there, and I know who I wouldn't want there. And some of those people that I wouldn't want there are actually still in my life.
So it's an interesting thought, isn't it? That they're good enough, and that's okay because not everybody can show up for us in the way that we need, right? Or want. Um, and a lot of people can't really, um, they can't manage when someone is grieving or is in pain.
I agree. I agree. I had someone in the last 4 years, I had two people pass away. So I had to grieve in different ways. One was a friend that was very inspired by me, and another person was someone that raised me. The
Mhm.
friend was probably about 4 years ago. The person who raised me was last year. Um, and the grieving was different because at the time I was in two different relationships,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
the first time that person grieved, the person kind of made it worse for me by their reaction. And the second time, same thing, but they made it worse for two different reasons. The first one was the support they offered wasn't the support that I needed, is the support that they would have accepted if it was them. I think a lot of people fall into that trap. And then
Mhm.
the second one was more just unaware, right? Like
Mhm.
they didn't do anything bad, they didn't do anything good, they just didn't do anything. They're right in the middle, right?
Mhm.
So I ask you now, when it comes to the grieving process, whether, because I know you mentioned like it could be sexual, it could be a passing of someone, it could be anything. What's maybe some myth or some of the myths that happens when someone is grieving that you want to dispel and say, okay, this isn't true?
Mhm. When we have people around us who are witnesses to a loss that we're going through, and let's just initially keep it simple. Not that anything about grief is simple, because there is nothing about grief that's simple. I want everyone to know it doesn't follow a path. It's not linear. It doesn't go from A to B to C. It doesn't follow the five stages, which were written brilliantly by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote and studied what people who were dying were going through. The five stages were not actually written for people who were living with the grief, with the losses. It was for the dying. So oftentimes the interpretation is you're going to get to closure, because in her last stage it was acceptance, which is kind of a way to say closure. Um, More and more people are writing about, thankfully, the fact that there isn't a closure. There isn't an acceptance. When I was 27 years old, I lost my partner, and he was much older than me. And we had 2 years of like being together, and the last year he was dying. And it was really hard to talk about it, to um, get support, because the people around me thought I should be doing it in a certain way, and I wasn't doing it that way. And so somehow I was wrong. And then, and there is no wrong. If we can, as a support system, find ways to help people understand that the way they're grieving is right for them. And that can look like a lot of different things. So, one of the things that we don't think about is who someone is, like their personality type, when they are affected by grief. So, if let's say you're an introvert or an extrovert or an ambivert, which is like a little bit in between, you may go through the grieving process and dance with it, partner with it in a very different way. Someone who's an introvert may never go to group therapy, might not reach out to a therapist or get into a chat room or go to their church or synagogue or mosque to get support. Maybe they'll talk to one friend. Maybe they'll do it on their own. They'll read books. They'll become a little more scholarly around grief and what they're experiencing, right? But the extrovert, the extrovert's going to go to a group and maybe go to therapy and then have a group of friends and they're hanging out. And the ambivert will do a little bit of both. Because what these personality types are, which I, of course, did not in any way invent, I only took them and kind of looked at grief and the grieving process through that lens, is we can't expect that the way one grieves is is going to be the same as you grieve or the way that you've dealt with grief. And I'm really talking about all different kinds of grief because we have grief, I call them the big G's and the little G's, right? And the little G's, when they're not dealt with, it's going to sound maybe a little like, huh, what's Edie talking about? A little G. But I bet you know about little G's, and I bet your listening audience knows about little G's. That little G could be a bad haircut. If your identity and if your sense of self is based on your hair, and you get a haircut that really doesn't align with you, and you then couple that with other little griefs, it can feel much bigger because there are a lot of other little griefs that are kind of like culminating and gathering together. So it may not be one little grief, but it might be a lot of little griefs that say, oh man, this is feeling overwhelming. And then the reaction to the haircut, which doesn't seem like a big deal, is. I had a pretty crappy experience when I was about 4 years old. I was a pretty opinionated and headstrong kid. You're smiling. I'm glad you're smiling. Maybe you can relate to that. And my mom wanted to go get pictures of the kids, like all moms, want to do, right? And I wouldn't let her comb my hair. I refused. And my hair was probably about the length it is now. And so the next day she had all my hair cut off. And the next picture of me the next day is with a pixie. Now, I talk about that even though it's so many years ago because I don't just let anybody touch my hair, and that has been a wound, and that's grief.
I think some people only think of grief in one way, which is someone has to pass away. They don't think
Mm.
about other things happening in their life. Why do you think then we neglect or maybe aren't aware of the small g grief and only the big G grief?
You know, because we're told it doesn't matter. We're just told, oh, let it go. Let's forget. And even with the big G griefs, even with, sadly, women who lose children or women who have miscarriages or men who um, lose a partner that maybe they weren't living with or um, uh, married to. It's like, get over it, get over it. And there's that for some people there's a timeline. It's like, okay, it's 6 months, okay, it's a year, and the commentary is, well, you'll have another one or you'll meet someone new. And that was why I went into this work to begin with, because when my partner died, yeah, everybody, I was 27 and everybody just said, oh, you don't, I went to a group and it was all like kind of older people and everybody was saying, you're young and you don't worry, you'll find someone new. And that was not helping me. And so I realized I got to figure out this out on my own.
I remember that takes me back to what I touched on in regards to the grief. And I remember hearing something similar to there's people who would tell you that, you know what, you have enough time. It's like when a child passes away and you have two children, one passes away, someone will say that, well, at least you still have one, right? Or if a partner passes away, well, you're young enough, you can find someone else.
Right.
And it's unfortunate because I think people, they may have the best intentions, but I think sometimes what we do is we don't ask you how you want us support. We tell you how we're going to support because maybe that's what we want to hear, right?
Yeah,
A child passes away. Well, I have another daughter. Well, yeah, you do, but this child is gone, right? Or your partner passes away. Well, you're in your 40s. You can still find
that's
someone
right.
else, right? Like,
That's
why do you
right.
think people get caught up in projecting the type of support that they want to give instead of asking?
Mm. I think it's about helplessness. It's about wanting to be able to say something and make a difference. And there's anxiety around it, and there's helplessness. And our anxiety sometimes causes us to say things that if we were in our right minds, we wouldn't. But we don't want our loved one or our friend to be in pain. And there's this other piece that I think is really important, and I wonder what you think about this, which is, we all have a healthy denial of death. If we're just talking about death right now, we have a healthy denial. We must have a healthy denial. Can you imagine all of us walking around thinking about dying like all of the time? I think we'd all be nuttier than we already are, right? So when we have a friend who loses um, a spouse, a partner, a child, we want to clean it up, and historically, 150 years ago, when someone died, it wasn't, that the that oftentimes the body was taken into the home. Children saw it, adults saw it, and the body, you had a relationship with the leave taking of that person, and there was a ritual, and those rituals were really important, and they were part of the send off, and they were part of the ritual of letting go and releasing and also being a support. But we've cleaned it up so much that we don't have the gathering that we used to have within the home.
I agree. I think we've taken it, put it outside of the home, made a business out of it because it's not cheap now
Oh,
to bury someone.
it is not cheap at all.
Hmm.
I mean, coffins can be upwards of $20,000. I mean, okay, coffin, food on the table, coffin, I don't want to be seen as a bad person, coffin, mm, getting my kids clothes. Really? Very hard. Very, very, very hard.
Yeah, and I look at it as I couldn't imagine being in a situation where this person that you love passes away. You're only now you're grieving over that experience, right? You've lost a partner, you've lost your love, you've lost someone that you spent X amount of years with. Now you're looking to have their memory honored in the way that you want to, but there's a price tag on that. So that limits your ability to honor them in the way that you want. It limits the impact. So, in a way, and I'll get your opinion on this, not only are you grieving the loss of the person, you're grieving the loss of the ability to even honor them in the way that you want. So, right. So now you're
Right.
grieving
Right.
twice. What are your
That's right.
thoughts?
I could not agree with you more. And you're probably grieving. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of layers of grief in that, in everything that you just said. So it's the grief of the loss of the loved one, and then there's the grief that you may not be able to do it to honor them the way that you want to publicly honor them. And then there's the shame often that accompanies it, the regret, and that's also part of grief. I talk about 11 phases of grief, and those 11 phases like move in and out of one another, and that first phase is called emotional armor. And it's what I think we continue to go back to, where there's like numbness and there's dysregulation and there's shock and there's denial for sure. And you continue to revisit it as you move in and out of all of the nonlinear aspects of grief. And there are a lot of points of discomfort where the traumatic power of your grief, you affects who you are, how you are in the world, um, your and how you fear perhaps either being seen by others for what you were or were not able to do to honor your loved one.
You mentioned 11 phases. What are some of those phases and how does it impact the person?
So those 11 phases, they're I write about them in my first book, It's Grief. Um, and what they are, I would say, are more suggestions of what I think we might experience. So I had to like give some kind of formatting to them just so that they made sense. However, just for everyone who's listening, don't think for a minute that you're going to go to the first phase and then you're going to go to the second, and it's just going to follow some really nice course that you can rely on, because there is nothing that you can the one thing you can be sure of when you're experiencing this kind of grief, and really any kind of grief, it doesn't follow a path that you can count on, because you are always changing and you are always in this kind of liminal space and time, like kind of floating, and you dip in. So there's anxiety, and there's what I call the 3 Ds, which is depression and doubt, and there's anxiety, there's anger, there's forgiveness, there's integration. And my last phase is grace. And the idea of the grace is that there are moments when you find grace. There's moments when you find that sense that you're calibrated. I don't talk about closure. A lot of people are writing that there's not even such a thing. I want you to remember. I want you to remember, but I want you to remember peacefully. I want you to remember in such a way that your life is not overtaken by the memories and by the grief reaction, but rather, okay, yeah, I'm feeling this anxiety right now, and that is part of my grief, and that's part of the 11 phases. Oh, that's my anxiety. And what's interesting about anxiety, anxiety is a terrible thing. I've had my fair share of feeling anxiety. I see you shaking your head. Have you experienced anxiety?
Yes, yes. And I've seen people experience, like me personally, I've experienced it, but unfortunately it was caused by the people I was around,
Hmm.
right? Because of the treatment during the grieving period. So I started to feel it. And one of the ways for me to cope with that and to handle that was I had to put some distance between myself and those people. Because sometimes when you're grieving, if you don't have the right support system around you, they can make it worse and prolonged.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's take that, and there's a little piece of curiosity here, okay? Because what you said was you were anxious, and it was because you were not getting what you needed. Now, on the other side of that often is anger. When anger doesn't get expressed and it doesn't have a place to go, a place to land, and one is, you, me, whomever, is silent within their anger, doesn't honor it, doesn't address it, but just swallows it, it can turn into anxiety if within the anxiety, you find a way to tap into that anger, guess what happens to the anxiety?
Disappears.
It quiets. Yeah. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of anger around grief. There's so much anger around grief, I either because you didn't have time to say goodbye, or there are regrets, or you wish you had done something different, or there's guilt, there's remorse, there's this sense of despair, there's this sense of kind of role confusion. That's my second phase, is role confusion. Who am I? I don't even know who I am anymore. And I got to figure this out because I was this partner. I was this spouse. And now that I'm not, who am I? What am I doing? Who am I to the rest of the world? Who am I at work? How do they address me? How I've thought of myself as a partnered person for a long time, and now like I've got to try to figure out who I am. And that role confusion comes in and out. Again, it's the second phase of who am I? But when you start to get into the anger and the anxiety, and maybe you start to express anger in a way you never have, you're going to go back to, oh my God, who am I? I've never been this angry before, but I'm not experiencing this anxiety. Oh, then now that's curious. And then it's like, okay, so I need to forgive something in myself for allowing myself to feel this anger, because sometimes we're very critical, and we've got this judge and this critic, which I talk about in the book. I talk a lot about the judge and the critic, and really how to face the judge and the critic, and to not give them so much airspace, but to at least acknowledge that they're present.
Yeah, you mentioned the anxiety being touted in the grief, and that reminds me of the first time when I went through it. Was the person I was with? It was a friend that passed away, and it was a friend that I was. We always made plans to meet up. We lived in two different parts of the country, but we
Mm,
just couldn't meet up. We delayed it, and then we passed away. Now
mm,
you won't be able to meet up anymore. So when I was going through it, and I was reaching out to my partner at that time, her solution was to offer sex as a way to
mm,
soothe, right? And
mhm,
I found that disrespectful in a way because it wasn't what I needed at that time. And as well, it just reminded me of our previous conversations where anytime that there was a problem, she immediately went to that to try to resolve it,
mhm.
right? So not only was it the type of support I didn't need at a time, remind me of previous arguments we had, we were trying to overcome why she's using that. So when that was used, you're right, it made me feel angry because of it. And then I was anxious because now I'm still around this person while I'm grieving. Now I can't trust their supports because they've disappointed me in what they have offered. So I 100% agree with you when it comes to the connection between the two.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. And thank you for sharing that story. There are a lot of ways that we will cope, right? So as an example, she was saying for her, engaging you in a sexual um intimate relationship in that moment was a way to help you bypass your feelings. If only I can get you aroused, I can make you forget, and I can help you forget, and I can hold your pain through this adventure of being having sexy time. But meanwhile, it wasn't what you needed or what you wanted. She made an assumption. It had also been something that the two of you had grappled with. So, in the past. So, but again, her helplessness, when she felt helpless, it sounds like she went to the place where she felt powerful, where she felt confident, where she felt she might be able to make a difference. And that is something that we will do, and whether it's through sex, or it might have been, the partner offers, let's get stoned, or let's journey, let's take some medicine, here's a bottle of vodka. Why don't we drink? Um, So there's a lot of and I'm going to say unhealthy, but offers to try to numb, to try to take you away and out of the pain of your grief. And yeah, maybe it works for a second, but what I've learned is through my own trials and tribulations as well, that when you finally get into your sobriety, whatever that looks like, and you come out from the cloud that's been offered to you as a respite, that it's sometimes 10 times worse because
And
you're still having to meet yourself.
yeah, and that's you basically summed it up perfectly. That's what it was. She was always powerful in that sense, right? Because
Mhm.
anytime there was a conflict, anytime there was something that came up that maybe would make the relationship or herself vulnerable, immediately went to that. And it reminds me of someone that I saw online, and I shared this I think a little while ago because it was kind of shocking in a presentation I did. What this person, she was going through grief, and it's an acquaintance actually, but most of the conversation is through social media. Like, you have that one person where you message, hey, how are you doing, you catch up.
Sure, absolutely.
um right, so it's something like that. She was going through a grieving period, and based on her post, it seemed to hit her pretty hard, like it does a lot of people. But what she did, she began to take it online, and she wasn't using the people in her real life as a support system. So the more she focused online and the less she focused on the in person, she began to get attention that she doesn't normally get, especially
Mhm,
from the opposite sex.
mhm,
So this resulted in her taking up some of these offers, and they ended up being sexual, right?
mhm,
So now she's down that road where she's going on these dates, she's doing these things with these people, and it's an unfortunate situation because, as you mentioned, right, like sometimes we take up habits that aren't the most conducive to our healing process. And I always wanted to know, and I'll get your point of view, because from a man, it's easy, right? Men are like, oh, free sex, we're gonna take it, right? But from a woman's perspective, why do you think some women fall into that situation when they're grieving?
So I'm gonna pull back the lens because I um I think it's not just women. I think men do it too. And I think men do it differently. What's really curious is that um the reason that the different genders will, if we're aligning with two genders, but even within a non-binary perspective, that when a man is reaching out to have sex to calm his nervous system, he's he's doing it truly to calm his nervous system, not needing to feel intimate. It is it is a release, it is a physical release, and it may not even be joyful, but it is something that makes him feel something when he's feeling numb. And so men will oftentimes, whether it is the loss of a partner through death or the loss of a partner through a divorce, will go into the dating scene pretty quickly, will engage sexually pretty quickly. Not all men and not all women. Okay, but it is not necessarily a need for something that is romantic or is of the heart. It is actually just to maybe remember who they are, to see if they can even have an erection after going through everything, because that erection is part of their manhood, and they may be afraid. And for women, I see you smile.
I didn't even think about it like that. Just proving that, what, I can still perform in a
Yeah,
sense that
that's
I
right.
was performing before. Okay,
That's
good
right.
point.
Yeah, yeah. Well, being a sex therapist, I must look at all of the lenses, okay? And I think that men often are, when we talk about these deep issues, and I'm thrilled that, we're having this conversation, frankly, because I think that men are hurting a lot in our culture right now. They're hurting a lot, and they're grieving for a lot of different reasons, which we can get into. But many men are not even knowing how to behave anymore. They don't know there aren't like rules necessarily. And when you lose a partner and you need to go out and you want to start dating, or you want to just see if you can hook up, it's if you've been in a partnership for some length of time, it's pretty scary, and men are not inclined to talk to one another about the incredible fears that they have. And so they swallow it. It's all like internalized. And so you'll see that men are gaining weight, or that they're, using some coping mechanisms that may not be so great, but they're not sleeping. Maybe they're gaining weight. Maybe they're developing ulcers. Maybe they've got some gut health issues. Maybe they've got some or teeth. Our teeth actually take up a lot of stress. Maybe something's going on with their hearts. And we find that men who are grieving, who have not actually been through any kind of grieving process, but did just like found somebody, got involved pretty quickly, men will tend to get involved pretty quickly in another partnership, no matter what. Women will tend to take their time. Their sense of community is very, very different, the men and the women. And frankly, within the world that we're in, and even within non-binary communities, there is in the LGBTQ plus communities, how one deals with loss is going to very much depend on the community that they have to support them. And sometimes those communities are wonderful, and sometimes those communities have judgment. Sometimes those communities are religious, and so you can't even really explore everything, because it's all up to, you are who you are, and God is going to take care of you. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. However, it is a communication to give it over to some higher power. And though the higher power is important, you must also meet the self in this.
Do women then have a similar struggle, or is their struggle a bit different then?
I think it's different. I think, it's women are probably a little more protective of their bodies. Again, not all. A woman who's been in a partnership, and that partnership, she has a loss of her partner, she may very well wait and be terrified to engage. Maybe her body has changed. Our bodies changed, and sadly, as we age, and no matter how much we take care of our bodies, it doesn't mean that our bodies are the same that they were when we were 18 or 20. And if you're 30, 40, 50, and 60, whatever, they change. And so to go out, we're very concerned, I think, about how we are and how to date. And some women had only one partner in their lives, so now they're faced with, do I even dare to go out? Am I dishonoring the partner I lost? And of course, there's a lot of other complications which we haven't even touched upon, which has to do with, and this is for all people, if you've had a history of any kind of sexually traumatic predatory event, how you grieve the losses of a loved one are going to be impacted differently than if you haven't had the experience of a sexually traumatic predatory event, which, you know, uh, I would say it's about 1 in 3 women, and about, you know, six, 6 in 10 men, 6 out of 10 men have suffered some kind of or been affected by a sexually traumatic predatory event. And that doesn't mean, you can make it mean whatever you want or wherever your mind goes, but it doesn't mean that you were even touched inappropriately. Sometimes it can mean you witnessed it. Sometimes it means you got away. And there, but for the grace of whatever you believe in, you got away. But it doesn't mean you weren't affected. Not at all. And those experiences, those events that happen to us affect how we grieve, affect perhaps what we offer as self-soothing techniques, and our comfort level for whatever the norm is to start to go out to talk about our initial loss, because sometimes the losses, one loss, we may have forgotten something that occurred early on in life, and all of a sudden it is one loss. It is that grief of a partner or partnership, a divorce, even like the loss of a house, loss of a job, that all of a sudden opens something up in the brain that has been very nicely, neatly tucked away.
How does someone then handle that part of the grieving process where when they're going through their journey, it opens up previous trauma that either was buried, unresolved, or something that they thought was healed, but it wasn't as healed as they would like it to be?
I think healing is a really tricky word, because when we think of healing, and I really respect that this idea of I'm healed. And there are a lot of people in clients that I've worked with who just want to feel healed. They want it to be all better. And again, like the loss of a partner, this isn't about I'm going to be all better. It's about how are you going to live with what happened, and how do you find yourself, and how do you engage in developing your own personal identity, your social identity, your sexual identity, because those are the pieces that get lost when there's been that sexually traumatic predatory event. And there are things that arouse us that bring back memories. I call them pop-up memories. And it can be something we smell in the air. It can be the way somebody walks. It can be that a door opens suddenly. It can be that all of a sudden we're in a movie theater and the lights start to flicker in a way that you remember something. So healed is it's a personal definition. I guess what I like to kind of offer up is that it's it's about how you're going to walk with and partner with what you know, what you remember, and how can what you know and what you remember help inform your choices, and how can you regulate your nervous system, because that nervous system goes haywire, and our amygdala, our prefrontal cortex, which is this part of our brains, it's like, and it's like, okay, okay, I feel like I can't breathe. I feel like I can't breathe. And then what you need to do are have very specific rituals that you include in your protocol. Like, you feel like you can't breathe? I want you to hold your breath. Huh? You want me to hold my breath? What do you mean, hold my breath? Hold your breath. Because if you hold your breath, what you're actually telling your prefrontal cortex, what you're telling your amygdala is, if you can hold your breath, you can breathe. And being able to do that actually begins some regulation. Now, there's a point where all you want to do is you're in freeze. You're in that freeze place. And when you're frozen like that, it's good to also have some protocols that you follow for yourself. Because in that moment you feel stuck and you feel imprisoned. And I have something that I call the liberation protocol that I talk about around this very topic. And When you're in the free zone, it's being very aware that, okay, I'm frozen right now. I need to, I have a rubber band around my wrist. I need to snap the rubber band, and I need to have somebody I can call who feels safe because I'm not moving. And, we talked about grief, but when grief doesn't feel like it's letting up and it continues to be pounding at you, usually it's because there's something else there. Now, it doesn't mean that it just gets wiped out, because I don't want you to forget. This isn't about forgetting your loved one, it's how am I going to integrate them. This isn't about saying I'm healed from this traumatic wound, and but there are shadows that follow us, and it's about recognizing them and saying, okay, you know what? I am not living my full life. I didn't finish school. I'm not thinking straight. I every time I get in a relationship, I back away. Anytime somebody says, you're beautiful, you're handsome, and for guys it might be that they're not able to have that erection, or it may be that they're the very first time that they had a sexual experience, their bodies failed them, and that they walk with that. And that is part of what I call the sexual grief effect, where it's a natural response to a sexually traumatic predatory event, or something that's developmental. Like, it's developmental to go out and date and have that first sexual experience. It's a developmental experience, right? But if it fails, if something goes awry in that first time, it affects us. It affects any of us. And how we then deal with that, or how we walk with that, is is an interesting kind of journey. But for some people, it imprisons them, and that imprisonment, they feel stuck, they feel halted. And if anybody out there feels that way, you're not alone. I've been there. I am there sometimes still. And one of the first strategies of the Liberation Protocol is to have what I call embodied curiosity, to say, okay, body, okay, mind, what's happening here? I'm going to listen. And what are the messages I'm getting about myself? And what part of me is talking to myself? And that embodied curiosity, because the one thing we don't want to do is know, or listen, or hear.
What do you think then, Edie, are some of the obstacles that people face when it comes to the awareness of what you just described, and why maybe we focus on the actual grief itself, but not some of these other things that, as you mentioned, that pop up, such as the emotion, such as the awareness, such as, hmm, maybe there's something below the baseline that I need to consider as well as this.
Feels really big, doesn't it? Feels like, what am I going to do with this? No, no, no. And it's terrifying. It is so terrifying to all of a sudden remember something that had been put away, and maybe so well put away, so well, like, imprisoned by your brain, and your brain was protecting you, and then something comes up, and it can be because you've lost someone who you trusted and who you felt safe with. And it is in those moments that it feels like a crisis of the self. And then, so what do you do? It's going to be different for everyone, but the first thing is to at least acknowledge it, rather than ignore it, rather than trying to stuff it back in. I don't know. Have you ever, like, as a kid, did you ever have like one of those jack in the box things? You wound this, and then the jack in the box would come up, like you turn it, and then and that's kind of like, as funny as that was, it's as terrifying. And that's how a pop-up memory feels. It's like, what? And it almost feels clownish, and clowns can be really scary. And it's like, okay, my body just had a reaction. I need to write this down. I need to acknowledge it. I need to think about what just happened because I feel scared. And again, if you can't reach out to a self-help group, and there are self-help groups, sometimes there are free groups that are offered for people who have experienced this kind of trauma. There's an organization called RAINN, RAINN, and they are amazing. And it is a free hotline. And there are writing groups. AWA is a beautiful writing group, and it's private. And if you can afford to pay $20, great. And if you can't afford it, that's okay too. You pay what you can. The idea here is not to do it alone, not to go it alone.
When I went through the second grieving process, I had something that came up because the person I was going to, because they weren't there on an emotional level, and a mental level, it reminded me of all the times as a child that I felt abandoned.
Mhm.
And that's something that I was experiencing. And I conveyed that to this person. I said that I don't need lavish gifts. I don't need everything in the world. All I was looking for was, how are you feeling today? And unfortunately, I didn't get that. And it's been a struggle, and it was a struggle with that person for reasons I still don't truly understand. But sometimes I look back on that and I ask myself, did I go to the wrong person? Did I set the wrong expectations? Or did this situation reveal things in people that maybe I kind of saw, but I was ignoring it because all the other people were supportive? But I went to less people the second time around than the first time. The first time I went to a larger group of people and the disappointment was greater. This time I went to, I think, about 6 people. And that one person didn't necessarily do anything wrong, but they didn't do anything good. They're right in the middle. And then they made up for it because it was pointed out. So I go to you now and ask, is this process not only a learning about ourselves, but a learning about what we're willing to accept and maybe a learning about other people as well?
I think you really answered your own question, right? When we learn about ourselves, right? We 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 begin to understand what works for us in terms of the people who will support us, hopefully, what we will tolerate, what we will no longer tolerate. And sometimes we reach out to people who remind us of the bad behaviors we grew up with. And that these people, we can rely on those people to help us feel the way we felt as children. So when you talked about how you felt as a child, I that is, to me, it's a developmental hit. And there's sexual grief effect in that because you lost some part of you. And the losing of that part of you may affect how you, the relationships you have, the kind of people you're attracted to, and who you're comfortable with. And it may cause you to be blind in a way that you weren't thinking that you were ever blind. But you go to what's comfortable, what you know, not necessarily what you need.
It's like going to that safe place, even though, in reality, it's not that safe.
That's right, but it's, that was your love language growing up, perhaps being in that family unit. I know you described it really well, right? And being in that family unit, that's what the love language was. That's what it meant. And so, of course, your body, your mind is that you're going to go towards something that feels familiar. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best thing for you.
And that's something that I had to develop within myself. And I realized that words of affirmation was one of my love language, my primary one, because as you put it, and as we're sharing, right, as a child, I didn't hear that. But alternatively, when family members wanted me to like get over something or what I saw or to shut someone up, they gave gifts. So as I grew up, the gifts meant nothing
That's right.
because in your childhood, it was okay, Edie, shut up, I love you. Here's a
Yeah,
toy,
yeah, that's right. That's right.
right?
So I call that the invisibility factor, right? And there's a one of my colleagues and dear friends, Ruth Cohen, talks about neglect, and it is a form of neglect. And when there is that kind of neglect, you may then reach out to people who also neglect you and don't give you what you really need, maybe not even realizing what you needed. And as you have a relationship with the aspects of you that you don't get fulfilled by those gifts. You get fulfilled by being seen. But to be able to put it into words, to be able to say this is what I need, and to be able to assess for the ability of a partner to give you what you need is huge. The other part is how do you recognize it? One, that's where the curiosity comes in. That's where having some empathy for yourself, empathy with energy, that's the second strategy of the liberation protocol. And the third is developing a radical rapport. And that radical rapport is it's a rapport with the part of you that's been imprisoned. And the more you get to know you, the less having a viable it is to have a relationship with someone who comes bearing gifts rather than I see you.
How does then someone identify that within themselves who maybe doesn't have the training of an ED or terrain, but they're trying to figure it out nonetheless?
Well, if they're listening here today and they're getting some information, and chances are there's so much information out there about about the developing self. um, Sometimes it takes the awakening of a memory, or it takes a repetition of bad outcomes or outcomes that weren't so desirable. And it doesn't necessarily mean just relationships, right? It can mean, hmm, I keep going back to school and I keep failing, but I want to get out of the place that I'm in. My concentration is so bad. What's going on? Well, maybe the family story is that what's going on is that you were not applauded for going to school. School was not something that was valuable. And what was valuable is go and get a job, and we don't care where you work. You need to bring money into the family, and that's it. And you learning has no value. And if that was the message, then you've become kind of fused to that message. And the idea here is we need to defuse, we need to remove you from that. Sometimes it takes a repetition of a behavior and a response to your behaviors or your desires to dare to thrive, so that you actually start to dare to thrive, which is my new working title for this new book, Dare to Thrive. And dare to thrive so that you can get out of and break out of the imprisonment that you've been in. It's being able to identify, I feel like I'm imprisoned. I feel like I am held hostage by my stories, by my history, by the way I grew up, by a sexually traumatic predatory event, and I need to break out. And even the idea of breaking out might mean talking about it, writing about it, finding groups. And there are lots of groups that are safe havens for people to talk about this stuff.
Could that explain then why so many people who maybe feel imprisoned in this way that you described continue to look for peace, happiness, and success in all the wrong places then?
Perhaps because it's momentary, right? There's a there's something that I've recently, been digging my brain into, and the best way to describe what I've been observing. But when I had a chance to speak at Oxford University for 2 years in a row, it was pretty cool. I loved it. And when I was talking there this last time, it was an intensive group, and we broke the group up into three groups. So one group represented self-loathing, which is, I think, what happens to people when they are going through the sexual grief effect. It's that sense of self-loathing. Then there's liberation, and then there was self-love. The each group was given the exact same prompt. I want you to agree upon a sentence that best represents the self-loathing, the liberation, and the self-love. And then I want you to create either a machine or a movement that shows off, self-loathing, liberation, and self-love. The self-loathing group, oh, they came up with a beautiful sentence, and they got into these these horrible bodily positions of just being imprisoned. The liberation, it was like they found a sentence, they agreed on the sentence, and they were, yeah. Self-love, they couldn't agree. They couldn't find a sentence, and they could not find a body movement that worked for all of them. And the reason, and I've seen this more than a couple of times in my groups, and I think that the reason is because when there is this sexual grief effect and there is this sense of self-loathing, we may know what it is to feel love or to give love in a moment. But the minute that moment is over, the minute that moment is gone, there's amnesia. And it's as if we can't hang on to that love. We don't remember it. We don't remember that we're loved or we're cherished. And it's like the mind loves to play these tricks.
How can someone overcome that then if they're experiencing it, as you mentioned, it's momentarily, but they're trying to make sure that it's something that they can identify and resolve?
So it is actually identifying the self-loathing and going through that liberation protocol. Let me be, let me have embodied curiosity around this. Let me understand that I need to talk to the prisoner, to the hostage that is in my brain, that has in my body, that has stopped me, that is causing the disgust and the self-loathing and the shame, and it's really bringing out all of these aspects of the self and saying, okay, I'm going to grapple with you. I'm going to meet you where you are. And I'm going to have this embodied curiosity. And then I'm going to, like, I'm going to have some empathy, because we don't have empathy about ourselves when we're going through any of that. And to embody that empathy, to say, oh my God, what you went through. Because no one's doing it for us. What you are going through, what you have gone through is monumental. And then developing a rapport. I see you. I hear you. And yeah, this is tough. And we're not going to have a pity party. Okay. You're a survivalist. You're in the forest and you're trying to figure out how you're going to get out, and you're going to use every article you possibly can be. It's kind of like becoming a raven or a crow. You're going to use everything to help yourself get out. But it's you first need those three liberation protocols first. And then you start to say, oh gosh, I'm beginning to feel a little liberated. And it is in that liberation that the empathy that helps you feel, I've got some empathy. And then your brain can start to open up. You're getting different messages, neural pathways, new neural pathways are getting formed. And then little by little, your little doses of love. Wow, I'm remembering this. And when I walk away, I'm going to write down what I remember that my friend just told me about how much they love me. And I'm going to remember this, and I'm going to be curious about, have that embodied curiosity about that love. And I'm going to figure out where I want to hold it in my body rather than I'm going to just, it happened and I'm gone.
So, Edie, as we close, if I were to give you three wishes, what are three things that you wish people knew about this whole process and why?
I love The Wizard of Oz. I am just a lover of the story because it's a true hero's journey. And it doesn't matter where you come from. If you know that movie, it everybody relates to it in some way or another. And what happens is, Dorothy is given these red shoes, although in the book they were white, but in the movie they're red, and she does not know the power of these red shoes, and she has to meet all of her tasks. She must, and these are the parts of herself that need to be developed: her brain, her heart, and her courage. And what I want people to know is this work is about meeting your brain, it's about meeting your heart, and it's about meeting your courage. And so she goes through all of these tools and tasks, and they all go to meet this wizard who's incredibly disappointing and is not going to be the person that's going to save them. But what we realize is that they have had to embody their own curiosity. They've had to find empathy that's just incredibly powerful. And they've had to develop a radical rapport with the self. And at the end, she is told what those shoes, the power of those shoes. But meanwhile, she had the power all along. And what I want everyone to know is that no matter where you are, no matter where you feel stuck, no matter how hard it is, and it's hard, and then sometimes it's ugly, and sometimes it's beautiful, that whatever your emerald city is, whatever your dreams are, that you can dare to live because, like those red shoes, you've had the power all along.